I wrote Structural Combat, and let's read some of it. All right, Ben Saul's words. The UN General Assembly itself separately turned its attention to the problem of terrorism throughout the 1970s. States were unable to agree on a definition of terrorism, the causes of it, measures to address it. Disagreement was particularly sharp on liberation violence and state terrorism, while socialist states also accused Western powers of imperialistic and capitalistic violence. A breakthrough came in 1994 in the 1994 Declaration on Measures Against International Terrorism, which condemns terrorism as criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, a group of persons, or particular persons for political purposes. It adds such acts are in any circumstance unjustifiable, whatever the considerations of a political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or any other nature that may be invoked to justify them. Regular subsequent resolutions affirmed this approach. The General Assembly and the Security Council have further identified terrorism as a threat to international security, human rights, and stable governance. Despite the growing political consensus, many states have continued to differentiate self-determination violence from terrorism and insist on the need for a legal, as opposed to the above political definition. Particularly in the 118 states of the non-aligned movement and the many overlapping 56 states of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. While the definition did not establish legal liability or crime of terrorism or of a generate or of generate customary law, it indicted the world's basic political conception of terrorism. These were Ben Saul's words. And we're continuing with Ben Saul's words. Transnational terrorist acts increased from the 1960s, often perpetrated by liberation movements resisting colonial powers, and reflected in acts such as aircraft hijacking, hostage-taking against diplomats, or attacks on embassies, and other political violence. The international community responded incrementally by adopting numerous sectoral treaties since the 1960s. Most of the treaties avoid referring to terrorism, with the exception of 3 recent treaties since 1997 on terrorist bombings, terrorist financing, 1999, and nuclear terrorism, 2005. The Terrorist Financing Convention comes closest to providing a general definition for the limited purpose of criminalizing terrorist financing. Any act intended to cause death or serious bodily injury to a civilian or to any other person not taking active part in hostilities in a situation of armed conflict, when the purpose of such act is by its nature or context is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organization to do or abstain from doing any act. And then here are my notes. At this point, 1999, what the Braid understands as terrorism is clearly defined by the TFC. Breaking down its definition, we see that state actions which would bodily harm even a single civilian could classify as terrorism, which is a strongly humanitarian stance. It also carves out the distinction between combatants and civilians in its definition by mentioning armed conflict, which implies state actors who commit terrorist crimes could be killed without accusation of terrorism, rightfully so. Hold on, I think I skipped something there. By mentioning armed conflict, which implies state actors who commit terrorist crimes could be killed without accusation of terrorism, and rightfully so. When it mentions attempt to compel governments or intimidate the civilian population. It is clearly grounded firmly against colonial occupation. If it's not obvious why this makes perfect sense, I point you back to where the Braid asserts the primary purpose of law is the protection of self-ownership and all other human rights. Law can exist for one of two primary functions. Either it can be a safeguard to protect the dignity and liberty of everyone, or it can be a weapon of control that excuses violent atrocities against thousands of civilians. If we allow oligarchs and fascists to decide what law is, they will make it a weapon.